London's wealthiest neighborhoods had always been a world apart, the kind of place where immaculate Georgian terraces stood shoulder to shoulder, their white facades gleaming under the soft glow of street lamps, and expensive cars lined the curbs like trophies. But beneath the picture-perfect charm, something new had taken root. It began as whispers, a robbery here, a snatch and grab there, small incidents dismissed as isolated crimes. But soon, those whispers grew into a steady drumbeat of fear. The pattern was too precise to be chance. Residents who had once strolled confidently down their pristine streets now clutched their belongings tightly, glancing over their shoulders at the faint growl of an approaching engine. The culprits moved like shadows, never lingering long enough to be truly seen. They came on mopeds, small, agile machines that could slip through traffic like water. Through cracks. The riders wore dark helmets with mirrored visors, their identities hidden behind anonymity as cold as the metal they rode on. Most victims said they never heard them until it was too late. A flash of movement, the glint of a hand, the sudden tug of a bag or watch, and then nothing but the whine of an engine fading into the distance. These weren't crimes of desperation. They were precision strikes. The gang seemed to know who was worth targeting, as though they had an unseen list. Elderly women leaving boutiques with shopping bags, businessmen stepping out of chauffeured cars, tourists pausing to take photographs with expensive cameras. No one who looked like they carried wealth was safe. They struck in early mornings, when the streets were calm, and in dusky evenings when streetlights painted long shadows. They didn't need the cover of midnight. They were the cover. The police knew that chasing them was a dangerous game. The mopeds could dart into narrow alleyways, mount pavements, and cut across small pedestrian lanes where patrol cars couldn't follow. Pursuits often ended before they began, the risk to the public too high for officers to match the gangs. Recklessness. Even when police were near, the riders seemed to vanish as if swallowed by the city. The gang's speed and confidence unsettled the community. In Belgravia, a woman carrying a designer handbag was knocked to the ground in broad daylight, the thieves gone before passers-by even registered what had happened. In Mayfair, a man's luxury watch was ripped from his wrist as he unlocked his front door, the attacker gone within seconds. On a quiet street in Kensington, a chauffeur stepping out to open the rear door of a Bentley saw the contents of the back seat stolen before he could take a single step toward the fleeing bike. The local papers fed the fear, publishing grainy CCTV stills of black-clad figures on mopeds, their faces impossible to see. Each image carried the same unsettling truth. There was no clear pattern to their identities, but their method was unmistakable. Social media swirled with shaky phone videos, capturing brief glimpses of the thieves weaving through traffic, chased half-heartedly by pedestrians shouting into the wind. The gang seemed untouchable, their arrogance growing with each successful hit. Wealth in these districts had always brought a sense of protection. High fences, private security firms, and discreet but powerful CCTV systems gave residents the illusion that danger belonged to other parts of the city. But now, danger was rolling up to their very doorsteps on two wheels. The atmosphere shifted. Streets once walked with leisure now felt like corridors of uncertainty. The simple act of carrying a phone became a calculated risk. The hum of a moped, once a background sound of urban life, now triggered a primal jolt of unease. Even the architecture played against the victims. The tight, winding lanes, beautiful as they were, became the gang's playground. Long stretches, without heavy traffic, allowed quick strikes and easy escapes. Courtyards and mews that gave the neighborhoods their charm became perfect hiding places, where stolen goods could be swapped to another bike in seconds. The gang was not improvising. They were executing a system, one that the police suspected had been rehearsed and refined long before these streets became their target. In the evenings, when the sun sank low and the golden light made the limestone facades glow, the gang moved. Most freely. They blended into the urban noise, slipping between delivery riders and ordinary commuters. One moment they were invisible, just two more motorbikes in the city's endless hum. The next, they were predators, zeroing in on prey. Residents grew used to scanning their surroundings, checking reflections in shop windows, and listening for the sharp change in engine tone that meant a moped was accelerating toward them. Reports piled up faster than investigations could keep pace. Insurance claims surged. Expensive goods that once seemed safe in public became liabilities. Some shops began warning customers not to display purchases openly until they were inside a secure location. Private security guards were hired for even the briefest walks between boutiques and cars. The neighborhood's air of unshakable wealth began to fray at the edges. And yet, amid the fear, there was something strange, a sense that the gang enjoyed playing with their reputation. They didn't always take the most valuable items in sight. Sometimes they would snatch a mid-priced handbag while ignoring a watch worth several times more. Police speculated this unpredictability was deliberate, a way to make it impossible to guess when or where they might strike next. The randomness kept the community off balance, forcing everyone to feel like a potential target. Behind the scenes, the Metropolitan Police faced mounting pressure. These were not just thefts. They were public displays of power, humiliating law enforcement in areas where influence and money usually ensured quick resolutions. Politicians received angry calls from residents. Newspapers demanded to know why. The richest parts of London were now playgrounds for organized crime. But the police understood something the public didn't. The gang's precision was their weakness. Any operation that followed patterns could be mapped, if only it could be observed long enough. The challenge was to watch without being seen, to record without alerting the hunters that they themselves were being hunted. For now, though, the streets belonged to the mopeds. Each night, the city's wealthiest blocks settled into uneasy quiet, their lighted windows casting warm glows over empty pavements. And somewhere in that darkness, engines idled, waiting for the right moment to roar back to life. The game had begun, though neither side yet knew just how far it would go before it ended. The gang's rise through London's criminal underworld had not been sudden. Long before they began prowling the capital's wealthiest districts, they had been testing their methods in quieter, less watched parts of the city. These early strikes were calculated practice runs, small enough to avoid major headlines, but bold enough to teach them what worked and what didn't. They learned how to approach a victim without warning, how to position the moped so it could accelerate away instantly, and how to disappear into the city's chaos within seconds. Every mistake they made was studied and corrected. By the time they moved into the high-value neighborhoods, their technique was polished to near perfection. They understood the rhythm of the streets. In the morning, there was a calm predictability as residents left for work or errands. Midday brought fewer pedestrians and lighter traffic, making getaways smoother. Evening saw streets lined with expensive cars and people distracted by social events, phones, or conversations. The gang selected their times with precision, often striking when their victims were most relaxed and least aware of their surroundings. It was not chance, it was strategy. The operation was structured like a small company. At the top was someone who rarely, if ever, appeared in public. This figure coordinated everything: which neighborhoods to hit, which items to prioritize, and when to rotate the riders to avoid familiarity. Beneath them were the riders themselves, each with specific skills. Some were experts at weaving through traffic and knew the backstreets like they had been born in them. Others specialized in spotting targets, scanning crowds with trained eyes. To pick out watches worth thousands or handbags that would sell quickly on the black market, every stolen item was handled with speed. Within minutes of a theft, the goods were passed to middlemen who melted into the city before any police response could lock the area down. The mopeds themselves were rarely kept for long. They were often stolen to begin with, then either hidden in underground garages or abandoned in places where they would be stripped for parts. If a bike was kept, its appearance would change, number plates switched, bodywork resprayed, or decals applied to make it unrecognizable on CCTV. Their clothing was just as carefully chosen. Helmets with tinted visors were mandatory, making facial recognition impossible. Layers of jackets, gloves, and trousers meant they could change their appearance mid-escape, discarding or swapping clothing to throw off pursuit. Even their riding styles could shift, sometimes blending into delivery traffic to avoid drawing attention. To the untrained eye, they were just another part of London's bustling network of two-wheeled vehicles. The gang also exploited a critical weakness in law enforcement's approach. High-speed pursuits in busy areas carried enormous risks, especially when mopeds mounted pavements or weaved dangerously close to pedestrians. Officers often had to abandon a chase for safety reasons, knowing that even one wrong move could lead to a serious injury or worse. The riders counted on this hesitation. It emboldened them, making them bolder with each job. They could snatch a watch from a man's wrist in front of a crowded cafe and be gone before the shock had even reached the victim's face. The wealth of the targeted districts only made the crimes more lucrative. In places like Mayfair, Belgravia, and Kensington, a single successful hit could bring in more money than weeks of low-level theft elsewhere. Watches alone were a goldmine, lightweight, easy to conceal, and worth tens of thousands if they were rare or custom-made. Handbags from certain designers could fetch nearly as much, especially if they were limited editions. Cameras from tourists were quickly resold abroad, stripped of identifying marks, their data wiped. The gang knew exactly what would sell fastest, and avoided items that were harder to move. With each successful robbery, the gang's confidence grew. They began hitting multiple targets in a single day, sometimes within an hour. One afternoon might see a smash and grab on a parked luxury car in Knightsbridge, followed almost immediately by a snatching in Chelsea. The speed and unpredictability of the attacks made them feel untouchable. They knew that police resources were stretched thin, and they exploited that pressure, moving too fast for investigators to connect the dots in real time. They also avoided drawing unnecessary heat. Violence was used only when needed to break resistance. A shove, a kick, or a sharp tug was usually enough. The absence of prolonged confrontation made the crimes harder to pursue as assaults, allowing them to be logged primarily as thefts, which often carried lighter penalties. This was another layer of calculated control in their minds. The high-value districts were perfect hunting grounds. The streets were wide enough to navigate quickly, but dotted with side roads and alleys that allowed instant escape. Many buildings had underground car parks or service entrances that were rarely monitored. The sheer number of vehicles and delivery drivers provided cover, making it easy to blend in until the moment of attack. And most importantly, the victims here were worth the risk, not only wealthy, but often distracted, assuming their surroundings were safe. Still, the gang understood the importance of unpredictability. They would sometimes skip a day or shift their activities to another district to keep law enforcement guessing. Other times they would hit two separate neighborhoods far apart on the same day, forcing investigators to split their focus. It was a psychological game as much as a logistical one, and they were playing it well. The impact on the communities they targeted was immediate and visible. Shops began hiring security guards for short walking escorts to customers' cars. Residents stopped wearing expensive watches in public, hiding them until they were indoors. Tourists in the area were warned by hotel staff to be discreet with their belongings. But these precautions only highlighted the gang's influence. They had changed the behavior of some of the most affluent people in the city, bending their daily routines around the fear of a fleeting but costly encounter. In these same communities, the police presence became more noticeable, but it was often reactive rather than proactive. Patrol cars rolled down the streets after reports had come in, and uniformed officers stood watch outside certain high-end boutiques, yet these measures rarely coincided with the actual attacks. The gang's timing ensured they were gone long before any official presence could be established. What the writers did not know was that the very boldness that had made them successful was beginning to draw the kind of attention they could not evade forever. Their methods, once invisible in the vastness of the city, were now under a microscope. A specialist unit was beginning to piece together the puzzle, not by chasing them in the streets, but by following their movements after the fact, looking for the threads that tied each theft to the next. The gang believed they were invisible. In reality, their trail, though faint, was already being followed. Every engine roar that faded into the distance carried with it not just stolen goods, but clues, the timing of a route, the choice of escape streets, the point where they vanished from sight. And while the riders focused on their next target, others were quietly mapping their world, waiting for the day when the game would shift, and the prey would find itself in the sights of a new kind of hunter. The specialist unit tasked with ending the Moped gang's reign was nothing like the uniformed patrols the public saw on the streets. They operated quietly, embedded in the city's daily rhythm, invisible to anyone not looking for them. Their cars were unmarked, their clothing unremarkable, and their presence designed to pass as nothing more than another part of London's constant flow. The team's first step was not to chase, but to watch, patiently, methodically, without interference. They knew that any premature attempt to catch the gang could drive them deeper underground, scattering them into fragments too small to trace. Over the first weeks, the unit gathered every report they could find, from official police records to witness statements buried in community forums. They pored over CCTV footage that covered everything from luxury shopfronts to residential side streets. The images were often blurry or obscured, but patterns began to emerge. The mopeds favored certain types of roads, those with multiple exit points, light enough traffic to weave through, and no fixed cameras in the immediate vicinity. Certain days saw more activity than others, and even within those days, there were narrow windows when the gang seemed to strike with clockwork precision. What surprised the unit was the discipline of the operation. The riders did not speak to their victims, never brandished weapons unnecessarily, and never lingered longer than the few seconds needed to complete the theft. They were ghosts in motion, touching the scene and then vanishing. It was this precision that convinced the unit the gang was operating under a coordinated structure rather than a loose band of opportunists. Somewhere someone was directing them, and whoever that person was, they had a deep understanding of the city's geography and police blind spots. The team decided that to catch the gang, they would have to mimic them. Officers trained to ride motorbikes began patrolling in plain clothes, blending into the flow of traffic alongside delivery riders and commuters. Others posed as wealthy pedestrians, walking with visible watches, designer shopping bags, or expensive-looking phones. It was a dangerous tactic. The officers could become real targets, but it was the fastest way to study the gang's approach up close. Meanwhile, technicians installed surveillance equipment in places the gang frequented. Cameras were hidden inside lampposts, beneath balconies, and even in the foliage of rooftop gardens that overlooked key intersections. The aim wasn't just to record the crimes, but to follow the mopeds after the strike, to see where they went, which streets they avoided, and how they split up when pursued. Slowly, the net of observation tightened. A breakthrough came when the unit discovered an abandoned moped dumped in an alley behind a closed cafe. It looked like one of hundreds scattered across London, but its frame carried tiny scratches consistent with the tracker device having been ripped off. This meant the gang was aware of police tactics and took measures to counter them. The find also revealed something else. The alley was just 2 turns away from an underground parking garage. When officers checked the security footage from That garage, they saw a figure pushing a different moped into a van only minutes after the robbery had occurred. The registration of the van led to a dead end, false plates, and no traceable owner, but it confirmed the gang's method of instantly switching vehicles to throw off pursuit. The investigation deepened. The unit began tracing the black market routes where stolen goods appeared. Watches taken from Mayfair re-emerged in pawn shops far from central London, often after being stripped of serial numbers. Handbags surfaced in online marketplaces under vague descriptions. These sightings were infrequent, but each one linked back to a chain of handlers, a network that quietly moved luxury items into resale channels without attracting too much attention. By mapping these movements, the police weren't just chasing the riders, they were tracing the shadow of the gang's entire business. Then came the most important piece of the puzzle. During one staged operation, an officer carrying a designer handbag walked slowly through a known target area. The gang struck, exactly as predicted, and sped off with the bag. What they didn't know was that inside it was a small GPS tracker buried beneath the lining, indistinguishable from the handbag's original structure. The signal pulsed on the unit's screen, a glowing dot moving steadily through the maze of streets. They followed at a distance, careful not to close in too quickly. The path wound away from the luxury districts, through industrial estates and quiet residential zones, finally stopping at a nondescript lock-up garage. The officers didn't move in immediately. They marked the location, set up covert surveillance, and waited. Over the next week, they observed riders arriving and leaving, sometimes on mopeds, sometimes on foot. Packages were carried in and out. Vans arrived with covered cargo, leaving empty. It became clear that this was more than a drop-off point. It was a hub, possibly one of several. The unit noted every face, every vehicle, and every timestamp. They were building not just a case for arrest, but a map of the gang's infrastructure. The more they learned, the more they understood the scale of the operation. This was not a handful of reckless thieves. It was an organized system that relied on speed, discretion, and precise timing. The riders were just the visible tip of an operation that reached deep into the city's underbelly. And yet, despite the scope, the gang remained unaware of how closely they were being studied, that the unit's patience was tested daily. Every time a robbery occurred, the instinct was to move in, to shut it down before another victim was hurt. But they resisted, knowing that cutting the head off the snake too soon would only let the rest of it slip away. They needed to bring the whole network down in one blow, with enough evidence to keep it from reforming. That meant waiting for the perfect moment, the one time when the largest number of key players would be active at once. The GPS handbag had given them one location. Patterns in escape routes suggested another. Surveillance footage hinted at a third. Slowly, a map formed on the unit's wall, pins connected by threads of movement and timing. Each robbery, each stolen item, each change of vehicle was another stitch in the picture. The operation was nearly invisible to anyone outside the room, but inside, the tension was electric. And then, one afternoon, an analyst spotted something unusual. 3 separate mopeds, each associated with past robberies, were seen in the same area within minutes of one another. It was rare for them to cluster. Usually they spread out to reduce risk. The team cross-referenced the sightings with known escape patterns and realized that the gang might be preparing for a coordinated sweep. If they were right, this would be the moment they had been waiting for, a chance to trap the riders and the handlers in a single, decisive move. They didn't speak of it outside their circle. Plans were drawn up quietly, positions assigned, equipment prepared. The city outside continued its usual rhythm, unaware that something was shifting beneath its surface. The Moped gang still believed they were in control, still circling their hunting grounds with the same speed and arrogance. But the walls around them were already closing in, and when the trap finally snapped shut, there would be no easy escape. The morning of the operation began quietly, as though nothing unusual was about to happen. London's wealthiest streets stirred with their usual rhythms, delivery vans pulling up to discreet service entrances, residents stepping out in tailored coats, the muted purr of luxury cars gliding past rows of spotless white facades. The sun was bright, but low, casting long shadows over the stone pavements. To the untrained eye, it was just another peaceful day in the city's richest postcodes. But beneath the calm, something was moving. The specialist unit had been preparing for this moment for weeks, fine-tuning every position, every piece of equipment, and every escape block. Today they would close the net. The plan hinged on precision. Officers in unmarked motorbikes and cars had taken up discreet positions across the district before dawn. Some blended into traffic, riding behind couriers and commuters. Others sat parked at the edges of side streets, engines off, waiting for the signal. Surveillance officers watched from hidden vantage points, a rooftop overlooking a key intersection, a parked van with tinted windows concealing high-powered cameras, even an apartment rented solely for the purpose of observing the gang's most common escape route. Everyone in the operation knew that the gang worked like clockwork, and that meant the police had to be sharper than the thieves at their own game. The riders had been spotted earlier that morning in another part of the city, circling a shopping street as though testing the air. That alone suggested a strike was coming. The team watched the live feed from multiple points, tracking the mopeds as they threaded toward the affluent neighborhoods. There was no rush. The gang never moved directly to a target. They would pass through side streets, doubling back at random, scanning for patterns that might reveal a police presence. This time, there was nothing for them to see. The streets were theirs to take, or so they thought. The trap was set in layers. The outer ring consisted of mobile officers, ready to tail the mopeds at a distance without revealing themselves. The middle ring was a network of choke points, narrow streets and intersections where hidden units could move in quickly to block exits. The inner ring was the strike team, unmarked motorbikes and cars, positioned to intercept once the theft began. At each level, the timing had to be flawless. If the net closed too soon, the riders would scatter. Too late, and they would slip free. Shortly after mid-morning, the gang made their move. A lone pedestrian, wealthy-looking, wearing an expensive watch, walked along a quiet stretch of road near a boutique hotel. To them, it was just another stroll. To the gang, it was an opportunity. One moped slowed as it approached, the pillion rider leaning just enough to identify the target. In an instant, the engine growled, the bike surged forward, and the rider's hand shot out. The watch was ripped from the wrist in a single practiced motion, the victim stumbling backward in shock. Before anyone nearby could react, the moped was already accelerating away. The radio crackled with the first coded signal. The outer ring fell in behind the mopeds, keeping just enough distance to avoid suspicion. The gang followed their usual route toward a narrow backstreet that had always served as a safe funnel out of the district. This time, they didn't know that plainclothes officers were already shadowing them from multiple angles. The riders accelerated, weaving between cars, and turned sharply into the lane. The moment their back wheels crossed the threshold, the trap began to snap shut. Two unmarked police bikes slid in behind them at speed, their engines matching the gang's pace. Ahead, a dark van suddenly rolled forward, blocking the narrow exit. The riders tried to swerve onto the pavement, but a second van, parked innocently minutes earlier, pulled just enough to cut them off. The gang twisted the throttle harder, searching for a gap, but the pavement erupted with the hiss and clatter of a spike strip deploying from a concealed compartment in the van's side. Tires shredded instantly, the mopeds lurching as rubber gave way to metal rims grinding against the stone. The riders abandoned the crippled bikes without hesitation, leaping to their feet and sprinting toward the alley that led deeper into the block. They had used this escape route before, a narrow passage between buildings that opened onto another road, perfect for disappearing into the city's veins. But today, plainclothes officers were already waiting at the far end, stepping forward. In perfect sync. The gang froze for only a fraction of a second before turning back, but their original route was now blocked by the officers who had followed them in. There was nowhere to go. The air seemed to tighten, heavy with the sound of footsteps and short, controlled breaths. The riders were ordered to the ground, their resistance brief and hopeless. Within moments, the specialized arrest team had them restrained, every movement recorded on body cameras for evidence. The mopeds were photographed and cataloged on the spot, their serial numbers checked against theft reports. Elsewhere in the city, the other half of the operation was already in motion. Using the surveillance gathered over weeks, police executed simultaneous raids on storage units, garages, and safe houses linked to the gang. Teams moved quickly, cutting through padlocks, sweeping through rooms stacked with evidence. In one lockup, shelves held rows of handbags still in dust covers, watches laid out on black velvet trays, and boxes of designer shoes that looked as if they'd never been worn. In another, officers found dozens of mobile phones, some stripped for parts, others with identifying information wiped clean. Every item was documented, tagged, and prepared for forensic analysis. As the riders were led to waiting vehicles, residents began to notice. From behind curtains and over the tops of security gates, they watched the quiet precision of the arrests, some with relief, others with disbelief that the people who had terrorized their streets for months could be brought down in the space of a few minutes. But this was not an impulsive victory. Every second of that morning had been planned, every move rehearsed in silence until the timing was exact. By early afternoon, the streets looked normal again. The vans had gone, the mopeds were loaded into evidence trucks, and the undercover officers had melted back into the city. Tourists walked past without knowing they had just crossed a stage where the final act of a long-hidden drama had played out. For the gang, the arrogance of believing they could not be touched had vanished in the span of a few hundred meters. For the police, the months of patience had paid off, but they knew this was only part of the battle. The riders were just one tier of the structure. Now came the work of dismantling everything behind them. Still, the operation's success sent a message that rippled through the underground. The streets the gang had claimed as their hunting grounds were no longer theirs. The city might have seemed blind for months, but its eyes had been wide open, watching, waiting, and ready for the moment to strike. The arrests had been swift, but the aftermath unfolded with the same careful precision that had defined the entire operation. Within hours of the mopeds being seized and the riders taken into custody, a chain of coordinated searches swept across London. Warrants had been prepared in advance, and specialist teams were already stationed at locations identified during months of surveillance. The aim was simple: dismantle not just the gang's visible front, but every link in the chain that had kept their operation running. In storage units, hidden beneath railway arches, officers found rows of shelving stacked with designer handbags, their leather gleaming under the harsh beam of police torches. Each was photographed, tagged, and sealed into evidence bags. In one corner, a locked metal cabinet was forced open to reveal trays of luxury watches, some worth more than cars, their straps still warm from recent wear. Forensic teams moved quietly through each space, wearing gloves, carefully cataloging every item and marking anything that carried fingerprints, DNA traces, or identifiable serial numbers. Other sites were less orderly. In the back of a run-down garage in South London, boxes were piled haphazardly against the walls. Inside were hundreds of mobile phones, most stripped for parts, their casings mixed together in plastic tubs. Nearby, camera equipment lay in crates, some still bearing airline baggage tags from cities far beyond the UK. This was where the gang's stolen goods had been broken down, repackaged, and prepared for distribution through the black market. Computers seized from the same location revealed ledgers, some encrypted, others in crude handwritten code, detailing transactions, dates, and amounts. The records told the story of a business that had moved millions of pounds worth of stolen property in less than a year. Meanwhile, the writers sat in separate interview rooms at police headquarters, each facing questions that were no longer speculative. Investigators already had footage of the robberies, GPS data from tracked items, and witness statements linking them to the scenes. The strategy was to isolate them, to make it clear that their network was collapsing outside while they waited. In custody, the gang's middlemen, the handlers who took possession of stolen goods and moved them into resale channels, were picked up in simultaneous raids. Some were caught in small apartments filled with designer items they had yet to pass along. Others were found running seemingly legitimate businesses, pawn shops, electronics repair stalls, online resale accounts that acted as fronts for laundering stolen goods. Their removal was as important as capturing the riders. Without them, the flow of stolen property would dry up. News of the operation broke by evening. The headlines were immediate and bold, accompanied by images of seized goods laid out in neat rows. Television crews camped outside police headquarters, waiting for official statements. The public was shown grainy stills of the mopeds in action, contrasted with sharp, clear photographs of the same bikes chained in the evidence yard. Residents of the targeted districts expressed relief, some giving interviews about the fear that had shadowed their daily routines. Others spoke about the satisfaction of knowing the people responsible had been caught not by chance, but by a calculated strategy. Yet behind the scenes, the work continued. Forensic analysts began matching stolen items to open theft reports. This process was painstaking. Many victims no longer had original receipts or serial numbers, and in some cases, items had been altered to hide their origin. Watches were compared against databases of stolen property. Handbags were identified by unique stitching or wear patterns, and electronics were checked for traces of old data. Bit by bit, the items were linked to their rightful owners, and the police prepared to return what could be proven. In the weeks that followed, the scale of the gang's activities became fully visible. The operation had not been limited to the richest streets of London. They had targeted high-value areas across the city, moving between districts to avoid concentrated police presence. Their goods had traveled even further, some watches recovered. In the raids had been intended for sale in Europe, while handbags had buyers waiting in Asia and the Middle East. The network was international, and while the arrests had severed its core, parts of it would need to be tracked beyond the country's borders. Court proceedings began with the riders, who faced multiple counts of theft, conspiracy, and possession of stolen goods. The evidence was overwhelming: surveillance footage, GPS data, and forensic matches that tied them directly to specific crimes. The prosecution presented the case as one of organized, calculated criminality, designed to exploit gaps in law enforcement response times and public safety protocols. The sentencing drew attention not only for the prison terms handed down, but for the judge's remarks about the psychological impact of the crimes. The gang had not just stolen property, they had stolen a sense of safety from the city's most visible districts, shaking public confidence in security. That, the court noted, was a harm that reached beyond the financial value of the stolen goods. For the police, the operation became a case study in patience and precision. It was held up internally as proof that even the most agile and elusive criminals could be brought down with methodical, intelligence-led tactics. The undercover work, the hidden cameras, the staged targets, all of it had built toward a single day where the trap closed cleanly. The risk had been in waiting long enough to catch not just the riders, but the network around them. And the gamble had paid off. In the neighborhoods once haunted by the gang, life slowly returned to normal. The sight of mopeds no longer drew immediate suspicion, though the memory of the robberies lingered. Security measures remained in place. Residents continued to be more discreet with displays of wealth. But there was a renewed trust in the idea that the city could protect its own, that the predators who had once ruled the streets could be outmaneuvered. The final tally of recovered goods was staggering: hundreds of watches, dozens of handbags, electronics, cameras, jewelry, and other valuables. Many returned to tearfully grateful owners. Others would remain unclaimed, their stories untold, sold too quickly after their theft to be traced back. Still, the public saw the operation as a victory. The message had been sent clearly, not just to the gang that had been dismantled, but to anyone watching from the edges of the city's criminal networks. London's richest streets were no longer the easy hunting grounds they had seemed. Somewhere out there, in the hum of daily life, the city was watching. And for those who mistook its patience for blindness, the endgame would always come, silent, precise, and inescapable. The city had been living under a quiet tension for months, though most people going about their day didn't notice it at first. The signs were there if you looked closely enough, a flicker of fear in a shopkeeper's eyes when a pair of mopeds roared past, the way pedestrians clutched their bags a little tighter near street corners, or how some luxury boutique started locking their doors even during business hours. The problem wasn't random crime. It was a pattern. A small, tightly organized group was moving through London's wealthiest streets like predators through a herd, striking fast, vanishing faster, and leaving behind only confusion and fear. They had perfected their approach. 2 riders per moped, helmets hiding their faces, engines tuned for speed. They targeted high-value districts: Mayfair, Knightsbridge, Chelsea, where the pavements gleamed and the shops carried more in their front windows than some people earned in a year. Their method was simple: sweep in, snatch what they wanted, and be gone before anyone could react. A handbag from a distracted tourist, a watch from a man checking his phone, a tray of jewelry from a store whose security guard was just slightly out of position. The entire thing could be over in less than 30 seconds. The fear came not from the thefts themselves, but from how untouchable the gang seemed. Police patrols couldn't match their speed in the narrow, crowded streets. CCTV caught only blurry shapes, helmets, dark clothing, number plates that were fake or missing entirely. Witness descriptions rarely helped. Shock and adrenaline blurred the details. For months, the gang stayed just out of reach, taunting the city's ability to protect its own. Inside police headquarters, the frustration was building. Reports were piling up, each one similar to the last. Victims were left with the same stunned expression, the same disbelief that something so brazen could happen in broad daylight with crowds all around. Detectives knew they weren't dealing with amateurs. The timing of each attack, the coordination between riders, and the way they switched bikes and routes to avoid detection all pointed to a crew that planned each move with military precision. It wasn't until a particularly bold robbery outside a luxury watch shop in Knightsbridge that the turning point came. The gang had struck just before closing time, smashing the display case in full view of the street and making off with over £500,000 worth of watches. This time, though, one of the victims had been carrying a new model of smartwatch with an internal tracker. It was disabled within minutes, but not before it pinged a location, a narrow alley in South London. It wasn't enough to make an arrest, but it gave investigators a starting point. The decision was made to change tactics. The usual reactive policing, responding after a crime, wasn't working. This would require an operation built on patience, surveillance, and calculated risk. Plainclothes officers began shadowing suspected riders, sometimes for days at a time. Drones tracked their movements from above, while unmarked cars followed at a distance. More cameras were hidden along likely escape routes, each one feeding into a live monitoring room. The goal wasn't to stop the next robbery, but to watch it unfold, to let the gang commit the crime, while every move was being recorded from multiple angles. Months of observation revealed the pattern. The gang operated in rotating pairs, switching bikes and clothes between jobs to muddy identification. Their safe houses were scattered: a lock-up garage in Peckham, a warehouse near the river, a rented flat used only at night. They had lookouts who scouted locations hours before a hit, and handlers who took possession of stolen goods within minutes. The whole system was designed to keep the riders on the street for as little time as possible, making arrests nearly impossible without catching them in the act. The operation that would bring them down began to take shape quietly, piece by piece. It would mean letting the gang run free just a little longer, resisting the instinct to intervene too soon. Every officer involved knew the stakes if anything went wrong. The riders could vanish for good, leaving the city to wonder if they'd ever be stopped. But for the first time in months, there was a sense of control. The net was being woven, and the gang didn't even know it was there.